Everything that I've learned about Dungeons and Dragons traps, I have learned from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, or the Ark of the Covenant.
Hi, welcome to How to D&D. My name is Fred Wheeler, and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, but I'm not doing that alone. This is the Dungeon Master Roundtable number 7, and we've got some questions to answer. But first, Mark, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Mark, and with my friend Gonzo and Logan, we have a YouTube channel called Dungeon Class, and we feature mostly 5th edition D&D stuff, and we're all about fun stuff, even funny stuff, but we have all videos about all different D&D topics.
Josiah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I am Josiah, also known as Dungeon Dad. I have a YouTube channel all about D&D and D&D monsters specifically. You can find me on YouTube. If you search Dungeon Dad, gonna be the first thing that comes up. Better be. I haven't checked in a while.
AJ, would you like to introduce yourself?
If you type in AJ Pickett on YouTube, you will find me. I occupy an ecological niche in YouTube, basically similar to a few others. You could call me a sage of Dungeons and Dragons. I look up stuff. I drink coffee and I know things. That's my job. You can also find me on social media, the social medias.
Do you include traps, or what sort of traps do you include in your Dungeons and Dragons games, and why or why not? Mark, what about you?
Well, I like traps. I have used traps. However, more often than not lately, I don't, because my group has a hard enough time with plain old doors. It takes like hours for them to come to get through. And it's just a matter of like, they don't trust anything. They think everything's a mimic, to the point that Gonzo and I, we take turns DMing, and we're like, maybe we'll just have a door that if they open it up and just run in, someone hands them a bag of money. I mean, maybe we start doing that. They won't be so dang cautious. So honestly, we've had to back it down a bit because traps would just make things even slower. I like traps. I've used them I've all a variety of different traps, but honestly, of lately, I don't, because of my party they're a bunch of chickens and they're so cautious. It's like, come on, just run in there and so I love it when the barbarian just busts through finally, like, oh, finally we're going to move on a little bit. But honestly, it's just because of the group I play with, honestly.
What about you, Josiah? Do you use traps in your game?
This is kind of a weird question for me. My answer is yesn't. I have used traps in the past, and I will most certainly use them again. But something that I have to consider a lot lately, which honestly is a whole other topic in itself, which I will not get way into, but a lot of the D&D that I'm playing nowadays is we're streaming these games, right? So traps and puzzles are tricky when you're streaming because we're putting on a show. So I don't want the players to have exactly the syndrome that Mark was talking about, where it's like, oh, we're going to spend an hour in this room trying to figure out if this door is safe or not. And it's like, okay, guys, like, come on, we got like story beats to hit here. But obviously that does not and none of that translates to like typical D&D. So like off screen, yes, I do use traps. And I think the severity and frequency in which I use them depends a lot on the party. If there's a rogue in the party or someone who's kind of like a roguish archetype that's built around exploration and trap finding and stuff like that, I'm more likely to throw more traps at the party to give that character more opportunities to use their abilities and shine, right? But if we have nothing in the party that deals with any types of traps, like I'll throw them in occasionally here and there just to keep them on their toes, but I by no means am I going to trap like every single door in a dungeon or anything like that. So as I said, yes, and
AJ, what about yourself? Do you use traps, or what sort of traps do you use in your game, if any?
As a dedicated fan of Grimtooth's traps from the original AD&D, I love traps just in and of themselves. They're part of the hobby of world building, where you come up with a fiendish trap idea that the players are probably just like have no chance of seeing their way through. But everything that I've learned about Dungeons and Dragons traps, I have learned from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, or the Ark of the Covenant. Basically, there's a few principles in the trap scenes with him going through archaeological digs that everybody should take as big, like green flags. So you can include this in your game to your heart's content. The players are going to accept it because they've been trained by movies that this is the way it works. When you're first walking into your dungeon, you should have some sort of, like, this is also from not Kobold, Conan, and various other movies as well. You should have some sort of thing that, like, one of the wizards or the scribe or rogue or type of character can read, that gives them some forewarning about that they may have a theme to all the clues in this dungeon. And if they can start figuring that out, or just the idea that there's stuff on the walls that players need to pay attention to in order to make their life a little bit easier when it comes to the traps in this dungeon, forewarn them that there's going to be traps. That way they're not going to be checking every 5 minutes all the time, because you haven't really given them that lead in that there's going to be traps there. So there's places where they're going to expect traps to be. The antechamber, right before you see the dungeon loot, is just over there. You can see it, you can taste it, but there's a strange pattern on the floor and statues with mouths that go like that. You're like, this seems like there's going to be darts or something here. So you give them the heebie-jeebies that there's a trap around in the first place, and that there's some sort of logical consistency. The traps don't end the moment they've got their prize and they're moving out of the dungeon. In fact, that's when the big trap goes off, where the big rolling ball chases you out of the dungeon, seals off the dungeon behind you, so you got no exit, and then you run straight into the next monster encounter as soon as you get out of there, because Baylock is waiting to take the thing that you've just fought, done all the hard work for, and that leads into the next stage of the story. So traps are almost like, get along, keep going, run away from this as fast as you can, this bit is over now, or, well, you should have seen this coming, because there were signposts all around the dungeon that, yellow flames were thing, and the powder was yellow, and the gems were yellow, and the floor panels were yellow, and the player's like, so it's basically my fault my character's dead. Yes, as the dungeon master, that's always your intent. I didn't kill your character, you did.
Nicely said.
Oh dear. So this question, although I'm asking it, is kind of a little bit odd, because my response will kind of seem odd. But yes, I do use traps, but very rarely do I use traps. In fact, the types of traps that you see, they're never on a door, because of the very thing that you were talking about, Mark and Josiah, and that is that I don't want them to go through the door macro. I remember the door macro when I was playing Dungeons and Dragons as a player, which is first, perception check, detect magic. In Dungeons and Dragons 5e, it's an investigation check as well on top of that. And because we're not too sure if our detect magic will work, then we have to prod it or use mage hand, because those other things might not actually trigger or detect the trap that's there. So we need to use a 10-foot pole or the mage hand, or throw a stone at it. So there's like multiple layers going on here. And so every time, players like, I use door macro number 1. I was like, oh, okay. It's not door macro number 2. No, door macro number 1. So it's like, oh my God. So I hate playing Dungeons and Dragons like that. So as a result, I use traps as trap rooms. So it's not the poor bugger who's out in front who gets hit by it. It's the whole party. Everybody has to join in the fun. And then skill challenges. And the very thing that you were talking about, AJ, me and Wally did. We actually made a skill challenge on a trap from Indiana Jones. It's the Boulder trap, and there's different stages to it, so that it's not like you trigger the trap, you take damage, and that's it. No, there are a variety of different consequences, a variety of different stages, and there are different ways of approaching it. And I think they work better as an action sequence when they do multiple things. A trap that just fires out darts is a boring trap. And a trap that just, has a swinging blade is not as fun. I mean, one of the best traps I've ever seen is one that incorporated monsters who triggered the trap once the party came into the room. It's a long room. It had scything blades that would swing at various distances along the room. They had to try and get past it. They were getting hammered by the monsters at the far end of the room. And so they had to sort of really change how they thought about dealing with that trap. And they didn't have to deal with it. If they thought it was too much, they could just we'll just go back. The door was closed, but it wasn't locked. it took them a little while to figure that out because they had assumed just because the door slammed, it was locked, but it wasn't. And they just open the door and leave. So I think that works better if you turn it into a skill challenge, a room that's a trap, the whole thing, and you make it an action sequence.
Have you ever considered that the traps can be a huge advantage to player characters? Because if you've got a dungeon with resetting traps, for instance, and your players have gone off the beaten path because they have been looking for secret doors, and secret doors kind of lead them into the service part of the dungeon, and they uncover a room where essentially the hydraulics or whatever is going on that's resetting the traps as the monsters move around the dungeon. So if you know where specific traps are, you can figure out where the dungeon monsters are as they're tracking around looking for you.
Yeah,
it's true. I once had a dungeon where I did exactly that, and the players went in and disabled the traps, and they were like, easy town, we can just stroll through here. But then there were much bigger, scarier monsters that had not revealed themselves because they were being kept in check by the traps, who then ventured further into the dungeon. It was like, oh shit, there's a gray render in here. Where did he come from?
Yeah, and I think also too, the other thing that players can use traps once they've figured out and suffered the consequences of a trap, they could use it against the monsters and draw them into it, provided they know how to use it in such a way that, you know, you got to use it at a distance because the monsters will probably know how to disable the trap. But as soon as they step into the wrong place, once they've disabled it, you reactivate it and they're in the kill zone. And that's the time when they get hit. Anyway, let us know down in the comments if you use traps, what sort of traps you use in your game of Dungeons and Dragons or your RPG game, and why. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.